Support for this program comes from Jazz on the Tube, the Internet's largest collection of free streamable classic jazz videos. From Miles Davis to Louis Armstrong, from Thelonious Monk to Duke Ellington. You'll find it all on jazzonthetube.com. Start your free subscription today.
Hi, and welcome to Jazz Talk, a Jazz on the Tube podcast. My name is Ken McCarthy, and this is where we talk with people who are doing important work that supports and illuminates the music we love. The writers, the scholars, the educators, the filmmakers, the producers, and more.
Hey, welcome everybody. We've got a really interesting show. Everyone's going to recognize, every Jazz on the Tube reader is going to recognize our guest's name, but also people that have been around jazz a while. You've seen this name over and over again, and now you're finally seeing the man himself, Scott Yanow.
Well, thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks for being with us, and thanks for helping add some class to our daily newsletters. We really appreciate it. It's been great to have Scott on board. It's been a wonderful thing, and you're finding some really good stuff for us too.
Oh yeah, well, there's all kinds of unusual treasures that can be found, on Jazz on Film.
Yeah. So you've got a new book out.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us the title.
Well, I just happen to have a copy here.
What a coincidence! Oh, I love it. Look, wait, hang on. Hold it up for a little longer.
Oh, okay, sure.
So we can all see the life through the eyes of a jazz journalist. Nice. My jazz memoir. Excellent.
Yeah, well, it came about because, I always tell jazz musicians, especially veterans, that they ought to write their memoirs because they've seen and experienced so many unique events, and some of them, a lot of them have numerous episodes and stuff, and that would be lost to history if they don't write it down, because once they pass, we don't really know the inside story of a lot of things. And my wife, Dory, suggested, well, when she heard me say that for about the fifth time, she suggested that I write one myself, because I've been fortunate enough to see an awful lot of great performances during the last 50 years, and occasionally run across different musicians and have different incidents and stories to tell. So I thought, okay, might as well write them down now while I could still remember them.
Great. I'm really glad you did that. And I think all of us, especially as we get older, have regrets that we didn't ask more questions or take note of things or write things down, because we realize these experiences are quite valuable to others too. You think of the young generation coming up. There's a lot of musicians they can only hear, I was going to say on vinyl, but they can only hear on digits, on streaming, and they have no fault of their own. They have no sense of who these guys were. So you've encountered musicians who you can share stories about, good stories, I trust.
Yeah, because I'm lucky enough to see so much stuff, there are a lot of stories that would otherwise be lost altogether. I could talk about a concert from 1972, and most of the people reading about it wouldn't have even been born yet.
There you go. Now you're based in Southern California.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, near Los Angeles.
Near Los Angeles. So you're sort of that's your epicenter for jazz. So I assume you really know the LA jazz scene and its history on a pretty granular level. But of course, you've traveled and seen other scenes too. But would you say you're mainly the LA is your home base for jazz?
Oh yeah, well, this room's my home base. in fact, this room is the center of the jazz universe.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that.
I don't think so, but no, I've been in Los Angeles since 1966. So even though I spent a little time in San Francisco and I have traveled a bit, most of what I've seen has been out here. So a lot of times people think I might be from New York, and the funny part is that I was born in New York, but I really spent most of my life out here.
Gotcha. And for us in New York, we're very chauvinistic. We're sure that New York is the center. We think New York is the center of the jazz universe. We're very mistaken, of course. But the reality is, all these cities, especially LA, is one of the prime examples, have fabulous histories and fabulous scenes.
Mm-hmm. Well, jazz has been in international music ever since about 1920 or so. Whenever recordings became available around the world, there were plenty of young musicians who learned from them and built their own jazz scenes. So you could go to pretty much any city and you'll find some great local legends who may not be that well known, beyond the city limits. So the music is everywhere. New York is the largest area for jazz because there are more musicians per square foot, I think, there than anywhere else. But still, you don't have to be in New York. What you have to do, though, is just have an open mind and listen and be creative.
Yeah, I heard from, unfortunately, I'm drawing a blank on his name, but he's a professor that wrote a great book, a bio of Lester Young and a story on the Blue Devils. And his thing that he was interested in was jazz in Japan, but also jazz in Shanghai, China in the 1920s. And it's like, wow, it just shows you sort of the diligence and the willingness of certain people to really extend themselves. Because you imagine being in Shanghai and getting a record, you don't know anything about it, and you listen to it and you somehow figure out what they're doing and then figure out how to add your own spin to it. That's just so amazing to me. I
know, you have to transcribe it yourself and just have to learn it by ear, really. And just to learn a completely new kind of music. Yeah,
and that's something that was a necessity in the old days, the ability to transcribe stuff, because there were no scores. There was no jazz studies program that you could enroll in. There might not have even been fake books way back when.
No, and way back when is, before 1970. So, I mean, it's really not, that's a distance, but it's not that far. In the 50s, if you were at a music school, you were always discouraged from playing jazz. In fact, it was sometimes considered somewhat illegal. You're supposed to be studying classical.
That's
so they sneak around, to play the music.
That's still the case in Cuba, believe it or not. They have a fantastic music education system, but it's all classical. And you're allowed to play the other music, but they don't necessarily help you play it. You have to figure it out on your own and find your own education, your own gigs, and yet they managed to figure it out quite well. Mm-hmm. For some reason, the names Charles Mingus and Eric Dolphy popping in my mind. If people aren't aware, that those are two LA natives.
Oh, sure. Well, there's been great jazz on the West Coast ever since the 20s, really. Jelly Roll Morton came out here around 1915 or so, and King Oliver was here a little while. And LA had its own scene in Central Avenue from about the late 20s to the mid 50s or so. There were a lot of great musicians. Someone like Art Farmer and like Eric Dolphy and Mingus and many other musicians who happened to live out here or pass through here. Ornette Coleman spent much of the 50s out here.
That's true. That's true. And Don Cherry and his whole group, Charlie Hayden. Speaking of scenes, how has the club scene evolved in LA over the years? I'm sure you've seen it go through a lot of changes.
Well, things haven't changed too much, and because back in the 70s, people were complaining there weren't enough jazz clubs, and they still complain.
So it's still a problem.
There's always been a lot of really great technically skilled musicians out in Southern California because of the studios, for one thing. That gave them work. But as far as playing jazz after hours, there's never been enough clubs, and that's definitely true right now. But there are an awful lot of musicians. So, the music's alive. It's just that commercially it can be difficult at times.
Are there any clubs in particular in LA that deserve special mention? So if someone's passing through LA and they want to catch some great jazz?
Oh, well, Catalina's in Hollywood. Catalina Bar and Grill is probably the top club. But there are other places. Vitello's, a very good Italian restaurant, has jazz. And Vibrato, which is owned by Herb Albert, that has jazz too. And we're all hoping the Jazz Bakery will come back. That was a place that Ruth Price, the singer, ran for a long time, but we haven't heard anything about that in a couple of years, so we're hoping.
Okay.
And there are other new clubs that have popped up too. So there are places for people to play. It's just that there aren't enough of them.
Gotcha. How about the festival scene? I know there used to be the amazing, maybe it still exists, the amazing Playboy Festival, Jazz Festival. I don't know if that still operates or if that was an artifact of a past era.
Oh, yeah. In fact, in that book, I talk about that festival because I've been to every one. It started in 1979, and I always said it was the only festival I could drive to in 20 minutes.
Nice.
I live pretty close. But I went to every one up until 2019, and then the last 2 years there wasn't one because of COVID. This year it's coming back. It just has a different name now. It's called the Hollywood Bowl Jazz Festival.
Oh, so interesting.
Not as catchy a name as saying Playboy, but it's back.
Now that's interesting. I wonder what happened there, because just as a totally non-musical sidebar, a new group has purchased Playboy, the Playboy brand, and they're doing a lot of licensing deals with T-shirt companies and fragrance companies and so on. And it's interesting they lost their jazz festival brand, because that was pretty nice to be called the Playboy Jazz Festival. I get, Hugh Hefner was actually a big supporter of jazz.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he had a lot of interviews with jazz people through the years, and they used to have the Playboy poll, like a downbeat poll, except it was a little more eclectic. They used to have that, and he actually attended most of the Playboy Jazz festivals, at least part of the day. He, at the Hollywood Bowl, he would almost take a parade. He and usually about 5 or 6 other bunnies would walk up and down the aisle. But he kept the music. He helped the music in his own way.
Oh yeah, because that was a very well-read magazine in its day, and it was sort of a style setter. And if he said jazz was cool, maybe some people that hadn't heard it before or hadn't really given it a fair listen might have been willing to listen.
Yeah, and it's definitely an eclectic lineup. It's getting to the point now where maybe about a third of it is actually jazz, and some of it is blues, which is fine. But then others, they have pop music and funk and all kinds of other things. It's basically a big party at the Hollywood Bowl, which takes place on a June weekend, 2 8-hour concerts with about 10 groups a day.
Wow! Just one after another after another.
Yeah, the stage actually turns around. It revolves. So because of that, the music generally doesn't stop at all.
Wait a minute. I got it. So there's one band ends and there's a band on the other side, and then the stage revolves, and there they are. The equipment's already set up and everything.
Yeah, usually. So you don't have to. There isn't time between groups usually.
What a great setup. I didn't realize they had that going on. Are there any other good festivals in Southern California that are worthy of note, that are not 20 minutes from your house?
I know, unfortunately. There's one, the one in Northern California, Monterey Jazz Festival. I go to that each year too, and that really is a great jazz festival. And I talk about that in the book, because I went to every festival from I think it was 1989 to 2019, so I went 32 years to that.
Wow.
And I'll be back this year. And what's great about Monterey is unlike Playboy, where you're basically sitting down the whole time and there's one thing going on, in Monterey, you walk around a lot because there's 5 or 6 different stages usually. And almost all of it's jazz and really high quality. I mean, this year it's going to be 4 stages because they're still gradually making a comeback. But at its prime, it'll be up to 6 stages again, hopefully next year.
And it's in a beautiful spot.
Oh yeah, it's so nice just to go to Monterey.
One of the things I really admire about Monterey is their education program for young musicians. They invest a lot in that, and that's so great. So Monterey, of course, I used to live in San Francisco in the 90s, and so they had the San Francisco Jazz Festival, which was pretty good. Mm-hmm. And then they had a festival literally on this. This was the best. This beat the 20-minute commute, because it was literally underneath the window of my apartment building. It was the Fillmore Street Jazz Festival, which wasn't a fantastically large festival, but it was quite good. And they would close Fillmore Street off. And again, I was 5 stories up. I could just open my window and sit on the chair and look out and right over the main stage. It was fabulous.
Oh, that would be fun. Yes.
Yeah. Keeping in the Southern California realm, how about San Diego? Do they have any kind of a jazz thing going on down there?
They do, but I don't get down there that often, so I'm not really an expert on that. I mean, I know they have their own scene and they have their own clubs. I mean, I know veteran alto player Charles McPherson lives down there, and then they have their own local scene, which sometimes you'll see them coming up to LA and vice versa.
Okay, so you get the flavor, the San Diego flavor. You're talking about local scenes. Sometimes really great musicians are not known to the larger jazz world, and one thing people need to know if they're not aware is to become famous is a big undertaking. Like, you got to work hard. You could be one of the greatest musicians that ever lived, but unless you and a team of people are working to make you famous, it's very possible no one would ever hear of you. What do you think about that as a statement? Is that accurate?
Well, jazz musicians, they really have to have two careers. One is working on their music, and the other one's working on their business or their career in general. I mean, it takes a lot of work, as you said, to become well known. But basically, the goal is for a lot of musicians is just to work steadily and to be able to be in an environment where you can create your own music and make a living out of it, so you can continue on. And it takes work. I mean, it's good to hire a publicist or to. If you have the money for that. If you don't, then you have to work on it yourself and just make sure that writers know about you and radio stations get copies of your releases and have a press kit of sorts with a biography and press releases, so you can send it to festivals, so you could be considered, and to clubs. Yep. It's a matter of hustling all the time. I'm almost like being a jazz writer, really.
And then for the musicians, to become famous, I think you have to travel. I think you have to, do the tours and go to the festivals. I don't think you can, if you're going to be known to the world, you kind of have to leave your hometown and be seen elsewhere. Does that seem pretty accurate?
It's pretty much part of the hustle. I mean, if you don't appear in New York once in a while, then the New York writers probably won't write about you. It might review your CD if you happen to get their attention, but it's good to be able to get as much publicity in as many different ways as possible. So yeah, you have to travel. I mean, there's a lot of great LA musicians who are not that well known outside of LA for that reason. But quite often you can't blame them, because sometimes they get a job teaching, so you're kind of based in that particular area, or you're comfortable, or you're working in the studios, and it doesn't make sense to travel too much. But as far as getting well known, traveling is important. I mean, it's good to be able to go to Europe once in a while and get the attention of the European press too.
Yeah, I don't fault anybody that having had to travel a lot for business myself. I don't fault anybody who can figure out how not to travel and just stay home and work at home. I mean, in their home base, because it's another dimension of exertion,
Yeah, the playing is the fun part.
Right, exactly. And we see them on stage, but we don't know that they've been hanging around the hotel all day waiting for the gig, that they arrived last night at 2 a.m. on a plane that was delayed, and that the next day they're going to have to be up at the crack of dawn to fly to the next place. They put in a lot of effort to be prominent. Yeah, you mentioned LA is really an interesting case, because there is so much. Actually, I was talking to an LA musician about this, and he goes, unfortunately, even the studios are starting to cut back on musicians. It used to be, they would think nothing of having an entire orchestra do a sound track, and now they've got the digital, and that's starting to cut back on that a little bit. But other than that, one can make a living as a studio musician and not have to leave town in order to pay the bills, and then play just for fun. Mm-hmm. I wonder, there's probably this probably is a lot of different people, and so we don't want to leave anybody out, but we'll just talk about some characteristic people. Can you name some people that are just super? You actually select a lot of videos for us of that fit this category. People that are super musicians. They make their living in the studios and in the show business world. They're great jazz musicians, but they just don't. They're not on the road. They're not pushing it. They're not even maybe recording that much. Are there anybody that comes to mind?
Oh, well, LA people that should be famous. trumpeter Carl Saunders, he's one of the very best on his instruments. He's like 70 or so right now, and he knows cream high notes. He's played lead with Bill Holman Orchestra, and yet he's also a tremendous soloist. And he recorded with Phil Woods, and he's done some records of his own along the way. But you wouldn't find him in the downbeat popularity polls because so many other trumpeters get more publicity. But I'd actually put him in the top 3 or 4 in the world probably.
And it's Carl Saunders?
Carl Saunders, yeah.
So is it S-A-U or S-A-N-D-E-R-S? S-A-U?
Saunders. And
great.
Scott Whitfield is a great trombonist. He's known to a certain extent because he did spend time in New York, but he occasionally gets forgotten. He's a great trombonist, a real good arranger, can also sing well. He's good. I mean, if I went down the list, there'd be people at each instrument really that are really great players that might not be that well known, say in New York or in Europe or so. Doug Webb is a really fine tenor saxophonist. Bill Cunliffe on piano, and Billy Childs. They're sort of known, but that they would be better known, obviously, if they were in New York all the time.
Yeah, I guess the message I want to give to our listeners is don't equate prominence with skill. There are some really fantastic artists out there that for whatever reason aren't in the top 10 lists and stuff. So it's interesting that you mentioned this about the need to go to New York and the need to go to Europe if you want to achieve a certain prominence, so that the writers there see you.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just the audience that you want to gather. You want the writers to see you and say, "Oh, this guy deserves some attention here."
Sure. Well, what's the matter with getting publicity, really? I mean, that's how it works. I mean, you would think the world is small enough now with the internet and with communication the way it is now that, people in Finland, someone in Finland who's a great trombonist would be famous all over the world. But unfortunately, you still have to pretty much perform live before critics and before audience members. And that's why you have to travel quite
Gotcha.
often.
So one of the things I always like to encourage listeners too is dig into your own scene. You may be in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or you may be in Portland, Oregon. You may be surprised. There may be some people in your town that are as good as it gets. Don't think, I've got to go to New York, or this guy's not any good because he's not in New York. No, don't think that way, because there very often are some amazing musicians in every city who don't travel. Hey, how since we've been through this period called COVID, how did this affect the jazz world as you see it from your experience of it?
Well, it meant that everybody took a 2-year vacation, basically. As far as the musicians go, now it didn't really affect my life as much because CDs are still coming out. Artists still need biographies and liner notes, and people still want their recordings to be reviewed. So I actually kept just as busy at the worst days of COVID than I was before. But as far as musician goes, I mean, they couldn't play live, so they couldn't play before an audience. So some of them were fortunate enough to be teachers, and they could still teach remotely, and some were able to, as you know, do live streams and do concerts online. But it was difficult because they couldn't have jam sessions. They couldn't get together. If you were part of a big band, good luck getting anything together, really. Fortunately, now it's been opening up the last few months, but it's still gradual and it's still not quite there yet.
Okay, because jazz improvisation is sort of a contact sport. You've got to be together with people. I wonder if some musicians feel they've lost some of their edge that they've got to regain by missing all that playing together time.
Well, if they've been practicing and if they've been, communicating with each other, I'm sure that actually now if you go see a concert, everybody's so enthusiastic about getting to play that it makes up for the fact that they haven't had that opportunity for a while.
Gotcha. Because, everyone talks about woodshedding, and that's true. Musicians need to spend private time practicing to get their technique together. But that practice time that we don't see, which is often significant, that's where another level of development takes place. Just hanging out with the guys and jamming, it's not sort of aimless noodling around. They're actually learning how to play coherently together, and that's kind of a skill that there is no book that you can read to get better at that. The only way the only way to do it is get with people and play.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. I mean, how do you get good? You have to keep on playing all the time. That's how it is, I mean, that's how it is with writing about the music too. You just have to write every day, really, or write as often as you can.
And you certainly do. You're one of the most prolific, if maybe the most prolific jazz writer. How did you get attracted to writing about jazz in the first place and your first opportunities?
Well, I first discovered jazz, way back 1970 or so. I first got into the music because I noticed in the LA Times, there was a mention that there was a Dixieland radio show that was on 5 to 6 p.m. Monday through Friday. And I thought, well, this is happy music. I'll see what this sounds like. And I got addicted to that fairly quickly. And, within a short time, I was taping things off the radio.
Uh-huh.
And then 6 months later or so, I discovered a swing show. So I got into that. And then when I went to college, that's when I discovered bebop, really. The story there is I heard the names Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, but didn't know anything about them because I was listening to Louis Armstrong and Benny Goodman, really. So I went to a used record store, and for $1.99, I found a Charlie Parker record that had him doing a bunch of songs I'd never heard of, Night in Tunisia and Ornithology, things like that. But it did have him doing one song I heard of, White Christmas.
Oh, right.
Because there was a request on a radio show, apparently, when he performed it. So I bought that record, and then I listened to it each day for 2 or 3 times a day. And it took me about 10 times before the doors opened up and I could appreciate what he was doing. And then from then on, I just went through the whole history of jazz over time, up until the current time. Got you.
Hey, when you were taping off the radio, I was doing the same thing, but not in 69, 70, that era. I was listening to top 40, but I also taped music off the radio, but I did it in the most primitive way possible. And I'm wondering if you did it the same way. I had a cassette recorder and I would just push record and I'd record it in the open air. Were you more of an audiophile than I was back then? Or how did you do your recording off the radio?
Oh, it was song by song, really. But, I didn't usually get the announcer, but I was just I'd tape everything, and then if I didn't like the song that much, I'd go back and erase it. But
did you use the cassette recorder, or how did physically?
Just a cheap cassette recorder. I was still in high school, and it worked for the time.
Yeah, I mean, talking about history, there are people walking around today who not even understand how we recorded stuff off the radio. Because that doesn't occur to them because they can just push a button and digitally record it, or download the MP3. The idea of going around with I still have, let me see if I can show it to you. Can you see it? I still have one of these things. And I keep it by my desk. I don't know why at this point. It's probably just nostalgia. But
it's just to remind yourself of.
But that's how we got music. We didn't have streaming. We couldn't go to YouTube and get download an infinite number of free tunes. If we heard
well, things do change. People used to go look for 78s, and people went to used record stores, which I still do. Looking for LPs and looking for things that I can't necessarily find because I don't necessarily just want it as a download. I want the actual album if I can. But to answer your question about how to get started, as far as writing goes, after a few years of listening to the music and being interested in all eras, I had a friend who was starting a magazine called Record Review. And the idea that he had was, it's going to be a third jazz, a third rock, a third classical, and it'll sell for 10 cents, and we'll make $1 million out of it.
Sweet.
We couldn't do the 10-cent part. The distributors didn't like it, but it did exist for about 8 years, and I was the jazz editor, so I basically started at the top. Haven't been a jazz editor since, I don't think, but. And over time, the classical section dropped out, and as did the country section, and the rock section became heavy metal. So it became the world's only heavy metal and jazz magazine.
Nice. That's fun. It's funny that you mentioned you were jazz editor. When I was once jazz program director on a radio station, so I also started at the height, and that was 20 or something. So that you had a chance, so you took it and you started writing, and Did you have any people that you modeled yourself out of, like jazz review heroes, or did you go your own way? Or
Yeah, I talk about that in the book. There were about 4 or 5 major writers who I liked their stuff, but I didn't really try to emulate them. I mean, Leonard Feather was, by far the most dominant and the top writer as far as having the biggest influence. And he had good and bad points. And I actually knew him a little bit because he lived in Los Angeles, and he was pretty accessible. But I didn't necessarily learn from him outside of, just admiring the fact that he was very prolific, because he did it all the time. That was really, the work ethic was really the main thing. And I like Nat Hentoff. And Ira Gittler was great for bebop, and Stanley Dance was great for swing. My favorite of all of them was Whitney Balliet, because he left for the New Yorker, and a lot of his stories have come out in books, a lot of his articles. And he was like a poet, just poetic. You could hear the music through his writing. So he's sort of like Art Tatum. You don't want to listen to him too closely or watch him too closely, because you don't want to copy him, because he's going to come in place anyway. But I was inspired by those writers.
Nice. Yeah. Ballet sort of gives you an atmosphere to immerse yourself in that kind of inspires you in your own direction.
Yeah, this is basically, I didn't have any mentors, and I didn't have anyone teach me. And I only took one journalism class, and that was kind of a joke, really, in high school. So it didn't really have any effect. I only took 2 jazz classes, and I didn't learn anything from either one of them. They were just like easy A's. I talk about them in the book too. One was Gerald Wilson. They're both worth talking about, really. Gerald Wilson, who's a great band leader and arranger from LA. He always had a history of jazz class. He taught at Cal State Northridge and later on UCLA. And the problem with his class is that he would get so much into the swing era and Jimmy Lunsford's band, which he had played with. We'll talk about them for hours. That he'd get to the final class, and it was still only up to like 1950. And even though this was in the 70s, it still was, way behind. So the thing about that's most memorable to me about his class is that he would put on a record, ask people if they had any idea who it was, and if they guessed it right, he'd give it to them. And if no one had an idea what it was, he'd throw it out to the audience, and people would start jumping over each other to get the record. I got some good albums that way.
He was an interesting guy, a composer, I believe, and an arranger.
Yeah. He was very talented, and he was an example of someone who was major, who lived in LA for decades, and so he didn't get as much recognition as some, but he worked steadily, and he kept pretty busy. The other person I took a class from in San Francisco was John Handy.
No kidding! Wow.
Yeah, and his class, at least he'd get up to 1960 before he'd start running out. I do remember that one time he had Sun Ra as a guest, and you didn't have any idea what Sun Ra was talking about, but his outfit was great, and everybody was talking about that.
Yeah,
He was dressed like a science fiction character from ancient Egypt.
There's a film, Space is the Place, which I'm sure you've seen or you know about, and that's a wild film. I recommend everybody watch. It's a real time capsule of life in the 70s. And I feel like after watching that, I kind of understand Sun Ra a little bit better.
To an extent, yeah. You never quite completely understand him, but his music was innovative, but he made it difficult for listeners, because you didn't really know. You'd get a record by him and it wouldn't have a date on it. And sometimes it'd be 1955 and he's playing electric piano, but you wouldn't know, and you'd buy it in the 70s or 80s, and you don't realize how far ahead he was.
Yeah, he was a hell of a...
But basically, those 2 classes, I didn't really learn anything from either one.
Well, yeah, but you got exposed to two good real musicians. I took 1 jazz class in my life, and it was taught by a guy named Carl Berger, who was a sociology professor, but his co-teacher was Benny Carter.
Oh,
that was
you did learn from him. Yeah.
That was awesome. And all that I remember, honestly, was, I don't know, it was a feeling. He had such class and such grace, such dignity. He was quite a guy. I got to hear him play a big band in San Francisco. It was for dancing. people were dancing to him. And it was a level floor. It was during I think it was the San Francisco Jazz Festival, and it was a level thing, and the band was on the same level as the dancer, so you could get really close to him and see what he was up to. That was just a marvelous experience.
Oh yeah, well, he was great at so many things, and he had like a 70-year career. I saw him when he was 90, and he still could play well. And he started when he was 20, basically, on records. So
he told a really funny story, and I wish I could remember the details, but he tried to play he ended up playing the trumpet in addition to the alto, I think, right? Or am I?
Yeah. He was good on trumpet, yeah.
But he tried the trumpet initially, and it was too hard as a kid, and he gave it up. And then he went back to it later. He thought it was too hard. He could never master it.
I actually heard with the trumpet, his parents were getting him an instrument. He got a trumpet. He couldn't play it by the end of the day, so he traded it in.
Yeah, that's what it is. Yeah.
Not realizing that it would probably take him about 3 or 4 days to master it, but
yeah.
He did later on.
So what was your first break? So you made them, you started out at the Record Review and the little magazine that I love the fact that it became a heavy metal jazz magazine. That's great. But then you're in Downbeat, you're in Jazz Times, you're in all the major publications. How did that happen? How did you evolve into that?
Well, I knew that Record Review was probably going to be dying after about maybe a year or so before it ended. I mean, we always said, Brian Ashley, who was the editor and founder of it, he always said it was conservatively financed, which basically meant they didn't have any money.
Nice.
It did okay for the 8 years, though. But near the end, I just sent out copies of the reviews to everywhere else. I said, I don't want the records to stop coming in. So I sent them to Cadence and to Downbeat. I got in Downbeat fairly quickly. And Cadence I was in. I wrote a lot of reviews for them. And then Jazz I got into it by the 6th issue. And all the other magazines, one after the other, basically. I just sent them letters, writers. If you're a jazz journalist, you really have to hustle all the time, unless you happen to be an editor of one magazine and you work for that magazine. But if you're a freelancer, you just don't turn down the assignments and just let everybody know what you do.
Gotcha. So
those days I sent letters. Now I still send out loads of emails. The same basic thing.
To the same publications, just to pitch ideas.
Yeah, I do that all the time. And if I ever hear of a new jazz publication, quite often I'll send them a note.
Gotcha. So that's reviews.
It's just a matter of hustling, really. Just a matter of hustling and just working all the time on it, really. It's sort of like being a musician in a way, but.
Yeah, I mean, very, very much so. So in addition to the pub magazines, you also do reviews, and you've done a lot of record reviews. So I imagine you develop relationships with the labels the same way. You just let them know you're around, and they probably all know you, but at this point.
Yeah, it took a little while, but yeah, I just send out letters asking for everything, and then once I get sent it, then I have to try to think of a place to place it. But usually I'm able to. No, I've reviewed over 20,000 CDs and recordings, I should say, CDs and LPs. And I don't know if that's first place, but that's got to be up there.
That's amazing. 20,000. And then you have your books. Mm-hmm. And I've got them right here. I've got the, where is it? All your thematic books, the salsa, not salsa, but Latin jazz, swing jazz. They're somewhere back. They're just back there somewhere. I can't turn my neck that well. So how many? You got a bunch of books out now, in addition to your memoir, which we're talking about today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's 4 books in all. Well, I started out with the All Music Guide because that's a story by itself. I have a whole chapter on that in this.
Oh, you do good.
Yeah, you see, some of it's humorous and some of it, I try to keep the whole book interesting. That's the main point. But I started out with that, and then the publisher of those wanted to know if I wanted to write some other books, and they thought it'd be a good idea, and they actually paid me to write 5 books in 2 years, which wasn't really, which, if you work on it full time, you can do it. And once I've done that, then ever since then, I've written maybe 1 a year or so, and then a few years passed, and that's why I wrote this book, because I thought, better get these stories down.
Gotcha. And I think people have a flavor of what's going to be in the book now. What else can you tell us about the book without giving away the good stuff?
Well, basically, I talk about how I got started, because that's that's the usual question. And I go into detail, but to a certain extent, it's not too long. But it's really, the book is really subtitled My Jazz Memoirs. So it's about my life connected to jazz, and, how did I first discover the music, and how did I get started with the magazines, and, the stories behind each book. But then once I'm beyond that, then I include 3 vintage interviews with people from the record reviews days, fairly long interviews with Freddie Hubbard, Chick Corea, and Maynard Ferguson.
Wow.
Well, all from the 70s, early 80s or so, that time period.
How wonderful.
What was fun is I had as much space as I wanted. A lot of times when you do profiles for magazines, they only give you a certain amount of words. But in this case, those cases, I was able to stretch out. And so each of those interviews kind of shows what their personalities were like. And
wow. So Chick Corea, Freddie Hubbard, and who's the third?
Maynard Ferguson.
Wow. Great. And I assume, did you do other interviews too?
Oh, yeah. But those are my 3 favorites from that time period. I mean, I talked to Javel Smith, who was a great trumpeter of 1920. In 1929, he was like the second best trumpeter, next to Louis Armstrong. But he kind of fell into a long period of not doing much musically. And then he was sort of making a comeback in the 70s. So I got to talk to him. And I've talked to Gary Burton and talked briefly to Benny Goodman. I talk about that in that just 5 minutes, but it was kind of memorable. And I talked to Audie Shaw and others along the way. But those three interviews came out probably the best. And
that's great. And they're in the book.
Oh, yeah, they're in the book full length. And then I also talk about my memories of the Playboy Festival, Monterey Festival, and just various concerts I saw along the way, different things that I remembered. See, I was lucky because starting in the late 80s, I wrote down basically the date and who I saw every day. So if I saw John Faddis play in 1993, then it's at a certain club, then it would say it. And that way I was able to jog my memory a bit and remember funny incidents or things that occurred along the way.
Oh, what a great idea. Because I'm aware of the concerts I've been to and the club dates I've seen, but I never wrote, sort of like they're time stamped because I was in different places at different times, and different clubs that no longer exist. So I know, well, if it was that club, like if it was the Tin Palace, there was a place called the Tin Palace on Bowery in New York City. Well, I knew it had to be the late 70s, very early 80s, because that's when that club was existing. But that's as close as I can time my memory. So you have literally a diary, a jazz diary.
Yeah, it doesn't really say too much in the list, but it does say what the date was and where it was. So I could say, oh, yeah, I saw this in 1988 on August 25th. And where would I get that from?
People will think you have this incredible memory. But there are people in the jazz world. In fact, my mentor who introduced me to jazz was a guy named Neil Carton. And if he's out there, Neil, I would love to talk with you. I'm trying to find you for years. But I was doing a jazz radio show at my college because the jazz had been abandoned. Like nobody wanted to do it. Nobody could. This was late 70s. And I said, I'll do it. And I didn't know anything about jazz. And I'm being a self-promoter. I made a poster for my little show and I put it all over campus. And one day this hipster guy from the 1970s era showed up and he sat there and he introduced himself and he came to every show and tutored me in jazz. Now, the reason I bring this up is you could drop a needle on a record. So forget the blindfold test. He'd know when it was recorded, the day. He'd know the studio. He'd know everything. I'm like, how does anybody? And he had, of course, at home, when I went to his home later when we were adults and had places to live as opposed to dorms, he literally had walls and walls of records. But he had a memory for all this stuff. I'm sure you've encountered people like that too. Maybe you're one of them.
Well, except I don't want to fill my brain with too much stuff. Basic numbers and the time of day that's recorded, I don't really need to know it. I mean, there are people like that. I know Phil Schaap, the late disc jockey from New York. He was kind of infamous for that. He could tell you everything about everything. I just want to know if it's a good record or not.
Great. But yeah, it's true. Phil was that way too. And it was probably natural. I don't think they studied. I don't think they tried to remember. It's just they had those kind of memories. But those kind of people are wonderful to have around just for fun.
Yes. So also in the book, I talk. I do give advice to writers to a certain extent, as far as just a general advice on what they should include in reviews, and basically it just says know your audience to an extent, and keep them, because the music's the most exciting in the world. There's no excuse for boring reviews and boring articles. You have to make it kind of interesting to read, and at the same time, you're not a main character. I don't use the word I in my reviews, except in very rare cases. I mean, in this book, obviously it pops through a lot, but in general, like when I wrote books like Trumpet Kings or Bebop and Tune, or even Jazz on Record, 1917 to 76, in those books, you'd have to, dozens of pages pass before the word I comes up again.
Gotcha.
I'm not a character, it's not about me. It's about the great musician.
That's so true. When I think of your work, it is, I once heard this about good writing. It's the glass on the store window. In other words, you, and even what you're saying is not so important. What's important is that you're illuminating so that people can see through the glass and see the amazing thing that you're writing about. I have to ask a question. How on earth do you write 20,000 reviews and make them all interesting? I mean, you've succeeded in doing it. And it didn't occur to me that, that's part of the deal. You have to make every one of them lively.
Well, of course, a lot of them are short, but I did a lot for the All Music Guide, probably about 10,000 for them. Which is pretty remarkable too. But that's a story by itself. But in general, just when you review a CD or an LP, I mean, what's on the record? What does it sound like? Is there a plot behind it? A lot of times when people write about records, they don't tell you what's on it. They don't. If it's a reissue, they don't tell you if any of the cuts are unissued before, or if there's anything new, or why should you get this record? The music's great, but what's special about it? And it's just a matter of when in doubt, just what's the music sound like? It's not that hard to do, but people forget it.
So you really are, because you mentioned that about advice to writers. Write with the audience in mind. And the jazz-loving audience wants facts. They want information. They want details, useful details. They don't want general impressions.
And also they really don't want you to just use big words just to impress each other. Sometimes if I need a dictionary to figure out if someone likes a CD or not, then they kind of failed.
Gotcha. Do you have a big?
There are times I don't know what they're talking about.
Really, even you. Do you have a big personal library of jazz books at home?
Oh, there's a big personal library of what?
Of jazz books.
Oh yeah. I have I think it's 9. I have written down like 963 books on jazz.
Wow.
Wow. But that's over a 50-year period.
I know, but still, I know how many 1,000 books is, because I have a wall, but they're just sort of books on all kinds of subjects, and I kind of know how much 1,000 is. That's a lot of books.
Yeah, but they're all good. I went through it not that long ago to see if there were any I should get rid of that are kind of weak, and I think I got rid of 2.
Yeah, it's very interesting how high quality so much jazz book writing has been. I'm the same way. I can't lose any of them. I have to hold. I might move them to my storage unit to make room for some new books, but I'll never give them up.
No, because if they're well done, they tell a story that you don't have elsewhere. I mean, that's what I aim for in the books, and that's what everybody really aims for. I mean, if you see a new book on Louis Armstrong, hopefully it has new information that you hadn't read elsewhere, despite how many books there might already be out on him.
Gotcha. How about your record collection? How big is that?
Well, yeah. Usually I don't say, but since I said it in the book, I actually have the exact number written down. Or
we could make it a mystery, so that you have to buy the book to find the answer to this question. Let's do that. We'll, really, because you've shared a lot in this interview. So if you want to know how many, this would be a great jazz trivia question, right? If you want to stump your jazz fan friends, because everybody knows Scott and Scott's reviews, and say, how many jazz records, how many recordings does Scott Yanow has in his collection? There is an answer.
Realize it changes hourly, though.
Oh, it does. Okay, that makes sense. Otherwise, your house would explode.
The stuff's always coming in, so it's like.
I was in the 90s. I was somehow I got on the list as a reviewer for internet books, and oh my God, they delivered these things by the pallet. So a lot of stuff I'm sure finds its way to your address.
Oh yeah, and well, if it doesn't, I ask for it. So, because it's really I said this for a long time. It's my goal to basically have every good jazz record ever made, and to have the time to actually listen to it all at least once.
So in other words,
the second part might be harder,
So in other words, you aspire to be immortal. You aspire to be immortal.
I just want to hear everything, really. I mean, I actually have a book, and is a listing book that has a list of all the albums that I don't have that I still want.
Oh.
So when I go to a used record store and see something for $3, does it look familiar because I passed it by 12 years ago, or does it look familiar because I bought it for 35 cents, at that time? So I still have something like 2,100 more albums I want.
Okay.
And basically those are all before 1990. So I mean, there's always new stuff coming out, but this is stuff that was either on LP or in the early days of the CDs that I happen to miss along the way. So that way, if I see a Stan Getz record, do I have it or not? Well, okay, I'll look it up just to be sure.
Makes sense. Makes a lot of sense. So you don't buy the same thing twice. Two last questions. You mentioned record stores. LA have any great record stores that you like in particular?
Oh, there's still stores left. What doesn't exist anymore are the chain stores.
Yeah,
you don't see Kids or Warehouse or something like that. But Amoeba is still a great store, even though they moved, and they're probably not quite as good as they once were. But that's a great used record store in Hollywood. A Record Surplus in Santa Monica. Freak Beat is a good place on Ventura Boulevard. There's a few others like that. I go there every once in a while. Now someone's really a fanatic if they're a jazz journalist and they get all these records for free and they're still going out buying records.
Exactly.
Then you know they're crazy.
Right, there you go. And last question, your favorite jazz books. And I know you've got 900 and something. Are there any ones that you think, wow, that's just, everybody should know that book, everybody should have that book?
Oh, it's tough. Actually, in this book, I do mention about 30 or 40 books like that.
Oh, okay, good.
It's tough. I mean, definitive biographies are always great. I mean, Ricky Riccardi has written 2 books on Louis Armstrong that are pretty superb, covering him really from the early 30s up until the end of his life. And he's writing a 3rd book that's going to cover the early stuff. There was a book on Sidney Bechet by John Chilton that is quite fascinating, but it's hard to say because if I look at the collection, I'll come up with 10 others.
Yeah, but it's interesting that you mentioned 30 or 40 books in your book. Mm-hmm. So if somebody's a big jazz reader, this is another reason to get Scott's book.
Well, at the end, I have a few appendixes. I have one that lists I forget the number, but maybe about 100 or so great jazz people from the past that people should explore. And then I mentioned about maybe 40 or 50 the current ones who are jazz greats. And then finally I list about 21 or so who I think are going to be great in the future. Because, it's very easy to think, oh, jazz is ending because look, this person's not around anymore, that person's not around. Well, people turn 110, they don't live forever. There's no more Duke Ellington or Charlie Parker or Miles, but there are a lot of greats around today. In fact, I think that really if you made a list, and I'm never going to do that, but if you made a list of all the talented jazz musicians that are alive today, it's I think the number is higher than at any time in history, particularly if you take people from Europe and all over the world. Now, we might not know who they are, and they're not drawing giant crowds, but there are talented musicians all over the world right now, young, a lot of them in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, and it's up to us to discover them and not mourn the fact that so many of the greats from the 50s are no longer around. The music's moving forward, and I'm optimistic about the future of jazz. Now, whether all those people will be able to make a living or not, hopefully, if they're creative in that way, that hopefully they'll figure out how. But musically, you know, there's just so much talent around it. It's the music itself is healthy.
You know, I'm so glad you said that, because it's an impression I have too. It seems like, wow, there's an awful lot of great musicians around it. There doesn't seem to be any shortage at all. So not only can people get a lead on some really good books that they can read, they can get your impressions of who some of the greatest musicians are today, some of the rising stars, and some of the, you know, the greats that are still with us. So there's a lot in this book, plus your memories, your memoirs of a life in jazz, which you are clearly someone living a life in jazz. Also, if somebody wants to be a jazz writer, this would be a great book to read, because you'll get some pointers. And then if you want to know the secret number, the ever-changing number of Scott's record collection, you'll have to get the book too. Do you have the book handy? Could you hold it up again one more time for people so they can see a cover?
I should mention, you know, it's about, luckily, you know, it's because it's self-published, it's on Amazon. So Amazon.com, people can find it all over the world. So don't have to worry about bookstores or publishers. It's there, you know.
Great.
I can credit and blame for anything in it, but you know, there aren't any misspellings, so I think it's fine.
Oh, good. And that's the preferred venue for them. To Amazon is probably the easiest all over the world. People can just get it delivered to their house.
It's easy. You know, if someone in England wants to buy it, they can. They don't have to worry about postage from the United States. So, you know, I mean, I'm glad that it was as easy to put out as it is now.
Great. Well, Scott Yanow, thank you so much for all you do and all you've done. I can't wait to dig into this book myself. That's the first thing I'm going to do when I get off this call, is order it. I'll add it to my collection of books, and I'm going to find the answer to the mystery of how many records does Scott Yanow actually have. I'm very intrigued by that.
Well, also, in 5 figures.
What's that?
It's still in 5 figures. I have an answer.
Whoa! Wow, interesting. So it's not 6 figures.
No, I've always wondered, you know, who has the most, and actually, if you have every jazz record ever made, you know, one copy of it, what would the total be? I don't know.
It may be an unanswerable question, given how many records, you know, were limited edition and never got reported on. Well, great, Scott. Thanks so much, and
thanks so much for having me, and, you know, for doing this show.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. I'm delighted to see this book come out. All right, take care.
Okay, you take care too, and thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you did, please share it. That's how we grow. And remember to subscribe to JazzOnTheTube.com, the internet's largest collection of free, streamable, classic jazz videos.